And I think we'll move on now to our final presentation of the panel. So we're next going to hear from Chantal Trudel. Chantal is a master's student at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and Chantal's talk is entitled Connecting Interoception and Boredom Proneness, a Novel Finding.
So I'd like first to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to participate in this forum, and thank you for being here to listen to my presentation. So today I'd like to talk to you about a novel finding that connects interoception and boredom proneness. So first you might wonder, why would boredom researchers be interested in interoception? Well, the starting point is the insular cortex. So previous research in our lab has shown that when boredom is induced, and then when we contrast it with a resting state, the functional imaging scans revealed an anti-correlation of the insula with the default mode network. So what you see here on your screen on the left is the default mode network, which is the typical activation of the brain when there's no external task to engage with. And then on the right, you see the anterior insula being down-regulated when boredom is induced. Giving the mounting evidence that the insular cortex form part of the salience network. The salience network is a system that detects relevant stimuli in the environment, and then the brain uses this information to coordinate an appropriate response. So when we saw that interinsula down-regulated or that was turning off, so to speak, during the boring task that we induced, we thought perhaps when bored, the brain does not just default to rest, but rather shows sign of attempting, but failing to engage with its environment. So there's another study as well, this one by Dalmas and Whitman, and that also revealed a link between the activation of the anterior insular cortex and attempts to engage with the environment to relieve boredom. So what they did is, after having participants performing several tasks, they were asked how much money they would be willing to pay for a music download. So as expected, they found that the more bored people were, the more money they were willing to pay for an activity to alleviate their boredom. So in this case, it was the opportunity to listen to music. So on the top left, you see the amount of money that people were willing to pay. It was significantly higher in the boredom condition than in other condition. On the top right, you see the change in price as a function of boredom. So the more bored you were, the more money you were willing to pay for your music download. At the bottom left, you see the coronal view of the activation in the insula, and the panel next to it, you see the correlation between the individual contrast values and the difference in price. So what that means is, again, the more activity there was in the insular cortex, the more eager people were to escape the boring situation. So in this case, it would be through the purchase of entertainment. Looking at this research on our own, we see that boredom and engagement seem to have opposing effects on the anterior insula. So it would be down-regulated when you're bored and then up-regulated when you're trying to get away from that boring situation. And we found this to be interesting and felt we needed to take a closer look. So then the insular cortex and its link to boredom was the first piece of data that pointed us towards looking at interoception. The second one was the connection between boredom and alexithymia, and that was mentioned by Joseph earlier in the, I think in the chat, which is the inability to label emotions. That's what alexithymia means. So previous research has shown, notably the work of Eastwood and colleagues, that boredom proneness, which can be defined as a propensity towards feeling bored more often and more intensely than most. So that's being boredom prone. This is associated with high levels of alexithymia. So in other words, if you get bored easily, you have a harder time making sense of your emotions or affective states. We also know the anterior insular cortex may play a key role in predicting and possibly labeling affective or emotional states. So as an example, you see the panel on the right. This is from the work of Hoogveen and colleagues. So what they did in their study, they compared patients with pronounced damage to the anterior insula to other patient groups with traumatic brain injuries. And they also had healthy controls. And what they found was really interesting, because they saw that if you have increased anterior insular cortex damage that could predict increased alexithymia in that population. So in other words, people with brain damage that affects seriously the anterior insula show significant increases in impaired awareness of their emotional states. So when we combine these two findings, these two studies, I should say, we see that if you're bored more intensely, more often than most, it's difficult for you to label what you're feeling. And similarly, if your anterior insula is not working well because of physical damage, you will also self-report having issues making sense of your emotions. So that was particularly interesting. In addition to being part of the salience network, being linked to boredom and to alexithymia, we also know that the insular cortex is connected to interoceptive attention. Now I'm getting to the interoception part. The interoception involves the perception and integration by your brain of your internal physiological signals, such as hunger, thirst, the urge to urinate. So interoceptive sensation provide information on the constantly changes in your body. So other everyday example of interoception that you probably experienced before, that would be the feeling of butterflies in your stomach, your heart racing, or feeling breathless. So in other words, they are physiological perception that are tied to some subjective feelings. You can see on the brain diagram here, the insula appears in purple towards the center. So it's been suggested that this physiological information is first received by the posterior insula, and then it maps onto the anterior insula. That's where it's integrated with emotional, cognitive, motivational signals that comes from the other brain's region. You see them shown in different colors here. So an important connection of the anterior insula is the one with the amygdala. And you will see it with a yellow arrow here. The amygdala is a key region for affective or emotion processing, so for where the emotion gets processed in the brain. So that was another interesting finding, actually, of the Dalmas and Whitman study I spoke to you about earlier, the what about paying more money to escape boredom. So what they also found was a greater activation in the amygdala in the boredom state than in the state of engagement. That's another key region related to emotion that is really important. So also the work of Craig and others suggest that the interior insula is important to represent your current state and to ascribe meaning to your interoceptive signals in the moment. Specifically what Craig suggests, and it is even the title of one of his articles, and that's the title of this slide as well, is this awareness of your interoceptive cues via the anterior insula. That's what allows you to provide an answer to the question, how do you feel now? Therefore, the anterior insular cortex is thought to play an important role in interoception by possibly predicting and ascribing meaning to affective or emotional states. So again, why look at interoception? And when you investigate boredom, if you put all the pieces together, we saw that boredom is associated with the anterior insular cortex, which is down-regulated when boredom is induced and up-regulated when you're trying to escape boredom. Boredom proneness is associated with alexithymia, which is the difficulty to recognize emotion. Alexithymia can result from extensive damage to your anterior insula, and interoception, the processing of internal body sensations, involves the anterior insula and is important for predicting and possibly labeling affective and emotional states. So then, looking at all this, the following question emerged. Could it be that the inability to represent accurately your own internal signals and the insular cortex play a role in boredom proneness? So to find out, we collected 2 samples totaling 350 people, and the median age was about 38 years old. So we used a total of 8 surveys. First, we measure, of course, the level of boredom proneness. Then we wanted to look at known relationships, such as alexithymia, as we discussed, and also self-control. And as it was mentioned by Baba before me, we know and we usually find that self-control is negatively correlated with boredom proneness. So that is, boredom-prone individuals tend to have less self-control. So we added then self-awareness, body awareness, And finally, we included different instruments probing the construct of interoception. The Interoceptive Accuracy Scale, a more recent one and detailed measure of interoceptive awareness, as well as that's the MAIA, the Multi-Assessment of Interoceptive Awareness, and then as well as the Interoceptive Sensory Questionnaire. That one is often used in the literature to measure confusion in those internal states in adults, and it's particularly used on the adult on the autism spectrum. Who typically show, this population typically show higher level of confusion with their internal states. And then I would like to show you what we found. So first, we replicated some relationships that are found in the literature. So that gives us some confidence in the validity of this sample. So you will see first here in the yellow box, the strong negative correlation between self-control and boredom and proneness, as we mentioned before. Then we, more importantly about the work I'm talking to you today, we also found a strong correlation between boredom proneness and alexithymia. So that is that people who are high in boredom proneness tend to also be high in alexithymia, meaning they have a harder time to label their emotions. And now what we found to be the most interesting would be in the circled in green here. So we found a really strong correlation between boredom proneness and self-awareness. So the self-awareness questionnaire. So the more boredom prone you are from these results, the more attention you seem to pay to those internal signals, to interoceptive signals. And finally, we found a strong correlation as well between boredom proneness and the Interoceptive Sensory Questionnaire. This means that people who reported experiencing boredom more frequently and more intensely than most also reported being confused about their body signals. So we found high boredom proneness associated with a high level of confusion around internal signal. So it seems that these individuals find it challenging to make sense of those interoceptive cues, although they are tending to them intensely. So taking a closer look at these findings, the Self-Awareness Questionnaire is on the left, and this one contained questions such as I feel pain extremely, I have an extra strong heartbeat, I feel full and bloated after eating. And on the right, the strong correlation with the Interoceptive Sensory Questionnaire, which contains questions such as I have difficulty making sense of my body's signal unless they are very strong. I only notice I need to eat when I'm in pain, feeling nauseous, weak, or I'm confused about my bodily sensations. So what these correlations show us is that although they're paying a lot of attention to their internal cues, boredom-prone individuals find it challenging to make sense of these interoceptive signals. So looking at all of this, we thought the results were great. This data was really interesting and almost too good to be true. So we decided to take another sample. And that's what we did. And we found similar correlation between boredom proneness and the scales of interest. So as you see here, we did replicate the negative correlation between self-control and boredom proneness. We also replicated the correlation between boredom proneness and alexithymia. So again, if you are experiencing boredom more frequently, more intensely than most, you also are, it's associated also with difficulty labeling your emotion. And circle in green here, the correlation between boredom proneness and self-awareness questionnaire. The more boredom prone you are, the more attention you pay to your internal signals. And finally, the correlation between boredom proneness and interoceptive sensory questionnaire, which shows that people who get bored easily and more often tend to be more confused about those interoceptive cues. Again, if you take a closer look at the replication of these findings, the correlations are not as strong. This is probably because the second sample was a bit smaller. However, we did find the same interesting connections between self-awareness and boredom proneness on the left, and the interoceptive confusion and boredom proneness on the right. Again, it is interesting to point out that the Interoceptive Sensory Questionnaire has been used in the literature in the past to measure to what extent adults are confused about their bodily sensation, and particularly with the autistic population. So two conclusions and a question emerged from our exploratory data. So the first would be that the first two conclusions was that boredom-prone individuals may attend inordinately to their internal states. They seem to be highly aware of those internal states, and they also have a weaker capacity to make sense of what they perceive. So it seems to be difficult to make sense of their internal stimuli. So these two conclusions, and then the question, well, could it be that a difficulty with labeling accurately your bodily sensation may partly explain an inability to predict which activity is most likely to attenuate boredom? And the chat, Josepha, I think, touched on that. The ability to predict what will actually attenuate your boredom or put an end to it, and therefore you're just perpetuating the experience. You're stuck in that loop. In other words, they might feel it very intensely, those boredom-prone people, but just be unsure of what action to take to alleviate the discomfort. Of course, we cannot generalize findings from 350 people. So the similarities between the two samples observed are intriguing, and they warrant further investigations, we think, of the connection between boredom and interoception. And this could be done, for example, by looking directly at interoceptive accuracy when you are bored. So we're getting ready to conduct direct tests to collect data on interoceptive accuracy in our lab over the summer and the fall. So the aim is to further investigate this novel connection between interoception and boredom, and by testing how well boredom-induced individuals can attend to their interoceptive signals, such as their heart beating. More specifically, in our heartbeat detection task, we will induce boredom, and then we ask participants to perform a heartbeat counting task. While you measure heartbeat over a period of varying length, and then you see how accurate they are at counting their own heartbeat. Now, there's issue with these types of tasks. So, for example, it can be influenced by the participant previous knowledge of the heart-based rate. So this is why we will also use another task, and this one is called the phase adjustment task. And in this task, we will record the participant's heartbeat and play it back to them. So it'd be like a metronome almost, and then they will be able to change the pace of that metronome faster or slower, and to try to match their actual heart rate. And then see if it matches as closely as possible. Additionally, we'll assess physiological markers of boredom. We'll be observing skin conductance and heart rate in participant. We are using these measures to replicate the pattern of directional fractionation that we have found in our lab before, and that's what you see on the right. So in this case, an increased heart rate and a decreased skin conductance. So during that experiment, heart rate and skin conduction were measured and compared when boredom and other states such as interest and sadness were induced. When people were bored, we found their heart rate went up and their skin conductance went down. So as a recap, given that the interinsular cortex is downregulated when boredom is induced and upregulated when trying to escape the experience, the interoceptive sensations are associated with the anterior insula, an important brain region for predicting and possibly labeling affective or emotional states. Knowing that boredom proneness is associated with alexithymia, a difficulty to recognize emotion, and that alexithymia is prevalent among patients with damage to the anterior insula compared to other traumatic brain injuries or healthy controls. And with our recently found significant correlations between boredom proneness and interoceptive awareness, and boredom proneness and interoceptive confusion, we are very much looking forward to collecting experimental data on interoceptive accuracy, and hopefully that may allow us to connect more pieces to our existing and novel knowledge regarding boredom and interoception. So this is what I have for you today, and I'd like to thank the people that make this research possible, the members of my lab, my supervisor, and our funding source, and thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take answers or hear your comments at this time.
Thank you so much, Chantal. That was wonderful. Yes, we have some time for questions, and also we'll probably have some time for questions for Sumana as well. So let's start with questions for Chantal. So there was some commentary happening in the chat while you were speaking, Chantal. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to catch up.
I'm not sure if there are direct questions
reading
there or not, but that you want to engage with.
What can help people in that situation? In the situation that they wouldn't, that they would be stuck in that loop of not knowing what will help attenuate the boredom. Yeah, reluctant pain and frustration. Yes, that's exactly what well, that's obviously an opinion, but that's what I feel. That's what boredom proneness probably feels like, right? Where you're just stuck in that that state that you can't get out of. And I think if you think of the Dalmas and Whitman experiment, I think that shows very much, because, you know, anytime you attribute a monetary value to something, I think it speaks very loudly to people. So people were ready to pay money, and the more bored they were, the more money they were ready to pay just to find something, right, that might help. Because we don't even know if the music download would actually make, you know, alleviate their boredom, but they were definitely, obviously, motivated to give it a try. So that's, I think that shows how desperate, right, at some point, if you are in that experience boredom, you can be too.
I think it's interesting in that context to go back to Erin's work with electric shocks, because the key point that she made that people don't pay attention to in that paper, I don't think, is that people were aware of what the shocks felt like, and they said they would pay money not to experience it again. So that desire to act can even overcome that, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, how we help people, just say for in your question, to better anticipate what would be engaging and better label their own emotions. I mean, I might turn that second part over to John. He's the clinical psychologist among us. So, you know, how do you help people better label their internal states, and in doing so help them cope with them better? But I think in the broader context of these things, it does relate to this notion of a you know, a potential explanation for some of the actions we're willing to engage in when we're bored.
So I have a question I'll throw out to you, Chantal, while we're waiting to see if there's others. I mean, the concept of self-awareness is a big idea, and, you know, notwithstanding the scale you used is titled self-awareness. As you pointed out to us, it's really about interoception, which is, I guess, one important aspect of self-awareness. Mm-hmm. You know, in some of the work that we've done, you know, in the past and more recently on alexithymia, you might consider that another kind of self-awareness, right? The ability to label one's emotions. So my question is, do you have thoughts about how to parse this idea of self-awareness into its important constituent parts as it pertains to boredom? And then I have a sort of a suggestion or a comment after, but let me just throw that question out for you.
So if I understand correctly, and thank you for your question, it's very interesting. In terms of like self-awareness as this big umbrella, and that to actually separate it into, well, self-aware of your emotions, self-aware of your body cues, self-aware of, you know, even I think to some extent self-aware of your, which would be more clinical. So I'm not, that's just I'm being imaginative here, but just even being self-aware of which strategies would work for you. That was mentioned earlier, right? So that also is something you can either develop or that's already there. I think you need to know what will work, you know, to get you to relieve boredom. So to what extent so if I go back to your question, you wanted to say to what extent we should separate these different definition or these components of self-awareness when we do research? Is that what you?
Yeah, it was sort of more just wondering if you thought there were important differences with respect to boredom, or if there's one idea here, and under that big idea, we should nest all of these particular things.
Well, for sure, now with what we found out about interoception, I can't help but see the parallel between having difficulties labeling my emotion, having difficulties labeling what my body's doing, what, you know, those cues that I'm getting. So this is obviously, you can see kind of the mirror of these two things. So in that they are, that's, I think, what the research we're want to do is probably trying to link those, or anyway, see if there's other connection between these two things. And then that with the interinsular being that connecting point. So I think that's where it's interesting dig a little further. If you were asked my opinion, I would say yes, I think these are very much linked. We just need to try and understand better what are these connections, how they are related. But in terms of like backing me up with solid data, then I think that's our intent for interoception anyways, is to try to gather data.
Mm-hmm. And so you might be aware of some of the older social psych ideas about objective and subjective self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And, in some of the work that we did on more subjective self-awareness, one of the things that I think would be a next step and maybe important for the project you're about to do would be to also look at how someone is self-focused. So are they self-focused in a ruminative way?
Mm-hmm.
And is it the type of self-focus that is really being picked up here, right? So, wow, I can't stop thinking about this, and they're sort of worried or ruminative about whatever it is they're attending to in their body, in this case, in the moment.
So rumination and self.
Other questions or comments for Chantal?
We are right now discussing on the chat box, I think.
Yeah, so please bring that forward into the oral discussion if there's something here that you'd like to address to Chantal.
I'm just putting fire on the chat box because it's easier for me to make myself understandable in writing.
Okay.
Instead of speaking, but wow, yeah, this is the future of boredom study. And I was saying, because what we really want is just to prevent that people to spend so much time feeling pain and frustration and so on. And just I was discussing with James, which was the solution, therapy, or what else?
Well, why don't we bring Sumana into the conversation, looking at coping strategies, right? And I have a question regarding her work, and I want to see if others have questions as well, because we didn't have time for a question right after her presentation. Sumana, do you have any thoughts about this idea about how we might help someone cope with boredom or respond to boredom if partly what's going on is this preoccupation with the self combined with an inability to actually identify the thoughts and feelings, or the feelings in this case, that are occurring at the moment?
Yeah, I think if we look at just general emotional coping literature, the most adaptive strategies for coping with any kind of difficult emotions is always, to try to either understand the physiological responses and like redirect what's happening at that point in time, like redirect their attention if it's too intense, or try to sit with the feeling and persist and try to understand why, what is the function and usefulness of this, and what is it really trying to tell you. So, and I think also nowadays, like, people are moving from the language of using coping to rather like managing and utilizing emotions, because like emotions provide important information. So I think with boredom as well, that's really what is the heart of the matter. And that's what we're seeing now with the most recent research on boredom, where people are now talking more about, well, is boredom a problem of meaning? Is boredom a problem of agency? Like either a lack of awareness of one's agency, or frustrated agency, or some kind of external constraints. And I think one of the things that we haven't really talked a lot about is some of the overpowering social constraints that exist, where given your position in the social hierarchy, you may not be able to actually do anything about the conditions that constantly give rise to boredom. So I think really More than looking at boredom as a problem, it might be more useful to look at boredom as the symptom. Like what is the information that it's really telling us? And I always try to think about also, I think a really confused negative emotion in people's like just daily experiences is anger. Because for a very long time, like anger has had this very negative connotation because it's, you know, it's aggression and destructive. But anger is also actually very powerful because it means, you know, it reminds you of what your boundary is. It tells you, okay, this is not okay with me. Like I need to stand up and fight. So similarly, you know, thinking about in that moment, what exactly is boredom telling you about yourself or the environment? But yes, learning to practice that and like, you know, not go into rumination definitely requires training.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you for reminding us of the social determinants as well.
Right.
Our social folks around the table will be pleased with that. Thank you so much.